What is textual criticism, and in particular, what is New Testament textual criticism? In this series, we are going to talk about the definition of textual criticism. We will talk about the goals, how we're trying to accomplish the task, what it means to examine manuscripts, what kinds of manuscripts are out there, what languages they're in, what are the major textual problems of the New Testament, how certain we can be about what the text of the original New Testament really was, and we'll talk about a number of scholars. There's going to be all sorts of things that should be of value and interest to many people who are interested simply in the text of the New Testament. The definition of textual criticism historically has also been the goal of textual criticism. It is simply to try to ascertain the wording of the original text of a particular document when that original document no longer exists. Now, that goal has been nuanced in recent years, and there's been a second goal that some have wanted to make into the primary goal of textual criticism, but let me address those issues. When it comes to New Testament textual criticism, the primary goal and the basic definition is to try to determine the wording of the original text of the New Testament because the original text no longer exists. If the original text of a document still existed, textual criticism would not be necessary. If all the copies of a document still exist, even though the original doesn't, and all those copies are exactly like each other, then textual criticism really would not be possible. So with New Testament textual criticism, our objective is to try to examine these copies to get back to that original wording. In recent years, textual criticism has been redefined, or at least New Testament textual criticism has been redefined. The goal used to be simply to try to recover the wording of the original text. But in recent years, the definition has become, let's find out what different scribes over the centuries have, how they've changed the text, and what those changes indicate about their socioeconomic, cultural situation, their religious background, their politics, this kind of thing. Now, that should not be the primary goal of textual criticism, but it has a very important role in the process of understanding the transmission of the text. And it also is a goal that should tell us, if I can find out what influenced a scribe to change the wording to X from Y, then that tells me that X is not the original reading, but it came from Y. Now, in terms of the definition that most textual critics follow of trying to determine the wording of the original text, there has also been, in recent years, a new wrestling with how we define the term original. And there have been some issues that we need to think about. One of these issues is an original text the text that an author initially wrote, but may have then fine-tuned it later on? Which one of those counts as the original text? That's a great question. When Shakespeare did his plays at the Globe in London, for example, he would fine-tune them, he would tweak them, the wording would change from play to play. When Mozart was doing his concerts and his operas in Vienna, then he would also be taking it through various changes. The fact is that if scholars were to find duplicate copies or more than one handwritten copy of Shakespeare's plays or Mozart's operas, which one would be considered the original? It's a difficult question. It's a tough question. So one scholar raised these illustrations and said the New Testament seems to be the sort of a document that is not capable of being able to define what the original text is. Another scholar pointed out that we need to have different ideas of what an original text is, and what he ultimately landed on, I think, as the best definition, although I'm not so sure he felt it was the best definition, was what Germans call the Ausgangstext. That means it's the text that exited from the author as it was dispatched to the readers. And this is also sometimes known as the autographic text or the autographs. I think that's the best definition of an original text when it comes to the New Testament documents. And so the issue here is this. When an author writes something and then sends it to readers who are in a different location, as soon as it leaves that author's hands, now we're dealing with that document which is finalized as far as he's concerned, and consequently that's what we would call the original text or more exactly the autographic or Ausgangstext. We'll use those terms interchangeably in this introduction to textual criticism, however, and that's the text that we are talking about. When we say original, it's what leaves the author's hands when it's dispatched to the readers in some other region. Textual criticism is necessary for the New Testament documents, just as it is necessary for virtually every scrap of ancient Greco-Roman literature, for two reasons. First of all, we don't have the autographic or the original text anymore. And secondly, no two manuscripts agree completely. Well, the reason no two manuscripts agree completely is because all these manuscripts, by definition, were written by hand. There was no movable type printing press until the year 1454, when Johann Gutenberg in the city of Mainz, Germany, actually invented the machine that could do this, and it was one of the greatest inventions of the last millennium. It happened a year after the Turks invaded Byzantium on May 29th, 1453, which will become a significant point for us as we think through some of the issues of the transmission of the New Testament as well. So within a 2-year period, 1953, 1954, two very significant events took place that affect New Testament textual criticism. But as I was saying, up until that time, we didn't have manuscripts printed on a printing press. They were all handwritten. And because they were all handwritten, every single one of them has mistakes in it. Now, most of the changes that these manuscripts have are very, very trivial. Spelling differences, for example, are among the most common, and largely because there was no standardized spelling of so many words in the ancient world. As a matter of fact, what's fascinating is, within the space of 8 verses in one chapter, in the Gospel of John, the author spells the exact same word. It's for those of you who know Greek, it's a third-person singular aorist active indicative of anoigo. The word means I open. He spells it 3 different ways within the space of 8 verses. Now, that's remarkable that we could have that kind of variety of spelling, but there weren't dictionaries that said there's a right way to spell, there's a wrong way to spell in these words. When it comes to the New Testament manuscripts, not only are no two manuscripts exactly alike, but as you look at the earlier documents, 2 of the closest manuscripts of the ancient world, when we're talking about first millennium, even we're talking about the first half millennium, the first 500 years AD, now we're talking about manuscripts that differ, even those that are as close to each other as we can find, between 6 and 10 times per chapter. Well, there's about 250 chapters for the whole New Testament, so if those manuscripts were complete New Testaments, we're talking about a couple thousand differences for those documents for the spread of the New Testament. Because we don't have the autographs anymore, because the manuscripts differ from each other, and because they differ at times quite a bit, at other times it's still minimally 6 to 10 times per chapter of the early and important witnesses, we have to practice the discipline of textual criticism to try to get back to the original. Ultimately, the objective, as we examine all these manuscripts and think about the data, is to try to sift through and find out what kinds of variants or textual changes were created either accidentally or created intentionally as a change to some other form of the text than what the authors originally wrote. And we'll wrestle with those issues as we get into this discipline a little bit more.